And so, tonight, the conversation is between Mark and Luke. So I will introduce them and then I'll hand over to them. So Mark Braude is the author of The Invisible Emperor, Napoleon on Elba From Exile to Escape, as well as Making Monte Carlo, History of Speculation and Spectacle. Mark is also a 2020 to 2021 visiting fellow at the American Library in Paris, and he is currently working on a book of narrative nonfiction about the French artist Kiki de Montparnasse to be published by Norton. Mark will be in conversation with Lucy Sante, who is the author of The Other Paris, Kill All Your Darlings, and The Factory of Facts. Sante has written for the New York Review of Books, Harper's, and the New Republic. He creates collages, among other things, many other things, and teaches writing and the history of photography at Bard College. I'm thrilled to be hosting Mark and Luke tonight. Thank you so much and welcome to the American Library in Paris.
Thank you so much, Alice. Thank you, Audrey Chapuis. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you to the staff of the American Library, and thank you especially to Luke for being here. There are many other books that we could have added to that list as well. Low Life is a favorite of mine. And this book, maybe the people would be the Times. Thank you for writing it. And I thought we would just jump in and I would ask you to perhaps read the first couple paragraphs of one of the pieces in the book, Base Culture, and then maybe we can start to tease that out. So I'll leave it to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you, Audrey. Great to be at the American Library in Paris once again. Always a pleasure. Wish I could be there in my physical body, but that's today's world. So I'm going to read the first two paragraphs of a piece called Base Culture, which was actually written for the Beastie Boys book. And my assignment was, what's going on sonically in New York City in 1981? It is 1981 in New York City, a distant planet, hard to see now. The Beastie Boys are just being embryonically formed in a rehearsal space somewhere. Elsewhere, the Butthole Surfers, the Cro-Mags, Motley Crue, Napalm Death, Run DMC, Sonic Youth, and Wham are likewise coagulating. In hospitals in other American cities, Beyonce Knowles, Alicia Keys, Britney Spears, and Justin Timberlake are being born. Ronald Reagan has, since January 20th, been the 40th president of the nation. The personal listening cassette device known as the Walkman has been available in the United States since the previous summer, but it isn't cheap and not many people have one. Instead, music is ambient throughout the city. It is everywhere, whether you like it or not. A song will come on WBLS as you're climbing the stairs from the subway station, and you'll catch it on a radio playing in a passing car, picked up by the outdoor speakers at a bodega, continued by a boombox hefted on the shoulder of somebody going the other way, resumed by another boombox in the basket of a bicycle weaving in and out of traffic, concluding in the pizza parlor you've just entered for a slice. Maybe the song is The Adventures of Grandmaster Flash on the Wheels of Steel and is brand new, first time you've heard it. So when you hear it in bits and pieces, mixed with car horns and sirens, you don't realize it at first. You don't realize at first it's all the same number. It sounds like an extended mix of Good Times by Chic with assorted other radio stations cutting across it, playing Blondie, Queen, Spoonie G. That seems entirely plausible because it's the sort of thing that happens all the time. Just as you can walk down one street and hear a single station emanating from every broadcast device, you can walk down the next block and hear charanga over here and Philly soul over there and skank down this way and doo-wop down that. The street itself can function as a mixing deck. If there's a really strong cut in the wind that week, it will serve as a moving backdrop, apparently always somewhere on the airwaves, while other sounds happen across it like billboards in a car window, or quotes dropped in by a DJ. And Good Times has been audible somewhere seemingly every minute for the past 2 years.
Lovely, thank you. So I love that this is so counterintuitive in terms of a way to talk about the Beastie Boys. They appear, I think, maybe sentence 1, sentence 2, along with like Wham and the Cro-Mags, and then I believe they disappear until you maybe name them by name, Adam Yauch and Adam Horowitz and Michael Diamond right at the very end. And in between, there's this passing of the musical baton, weaving in and out, and get kind of far from there's really no talk about fight for your right to party. It's everything but that. So I was just wondering, you mentioned the directive, what was the thought process behind doing that sort of reverse take on the Beastie Boys, if you will?
Well, the Beasties wanted, it's sort of like, what was happening on the day of my birth, because that's the year the Beastie Boys began. But they were, at first, they were kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? They were sort of a hardcore outfit, actually. And they played the last night of Max's Kansas City with Bad Brains. So there's really not much to report about them that year. They knew they weren't going to be the focus of this piece because it's all about the surrounding landscape into which they came into being.
Great, and that actually is a good way to sort of segue into the book as a whole, because that idea of landscape and surrounding and things that are sort of looking from a particular angle, I think, is a thread that runs through this book, which is writing in many registers. So I think perhaps as a way to get you to talk about what this book is, I might just mention congratulations that it was nominated for a PEN America award for, I believe it's the best collection of essays. And I have the official rubric is for a seasoned writer whose collection of essays is an expansion on their corpus of work and preserves the distinguished art form of the essay. So I was wondering, a two-parter, which is, what is this book? And do you feel that it does preserve the distinguished art of the essay?
Okay, well, this book was, at the basic level, my publisher said, it's been 13 years since we put out your last collection. Do you have a new one? And then it took me a year or two and a bunch of missteps before I came up with the concept of this one. And really, in many ways, this is, there are exceptions, but basically it's a kind of memoir in essays. It is a very personal book, much more personal than any I've previously published. It's got a lot to do with my youth. There are, profiles of dead writers and such, but they're all people with whom I have some kind of obvious or unobvious relationship with, through work and stuff, but very much focused on my youth in New York City in the late 70s, early 80s. And as far as the distinguished art of the essay, yeah, I think so, especially since this is the book where more than I've done in the past, I really try to push the essay toward other things. I taught a course called The Essay for years and years, and my introductory speech to students were, the essay is the Wild West, because we know what poetry is, we know what fiction is, but nobody knows what the essay is, really. Various people try to slap down a definition on it, but the great thing is you've got all this freedom. But people are constantly trying to curtail that freedom and define what an essay is, whereas I think, the essay's job is to try to trample over those definitions. And so this is a book where the essay gets pushed toward both fiction and poetry at various times. I just do everything I can to turn it upside down, inside out, etc.
I appreciate that you say it's a very personal book, because you are present, but it's actually, again, coming in from kind of the side, because it's very much talking about other people in a sense. And so I was wondering, we have, maybe the people would be the times, which is, right, it's Love, Arthur Lee, is that the title of the song, correct?
Yeah.
I don't think they feature in the book, do they?
No.
So maybe, some of the people we might talk about, because there's some interesting choices, not necessarily name brands, if you will, but people who are fascinating in what they did, especially in this time you mentioned of the 70s, the 80s. I'm going to say mostly below 14th Street in Manhattan on the east side, give or take, but we can expand on that. So let's there's a guy, Glenn O'Brien. For a guy of my generation, I'm in my 40s. I actually know him as the style guy from GQ back when I was a teenager, and those were great columns. But he had this fascinating life. So tell me about Glenn O'Brien and how he figured in your life and in this book.
Well, Glenn O'Brien was somebody I found extremely intimidating for many, many years because, he's incredibly polished and his conversational style, which I describe as, he pitched his voice like somebody trying to sell you reefer in the men's room at Mittens in 1946, Mittens being a jazz club in Harlem, because he was always like, he talked like this. And sometimes you could barely hear him, so you had to lean in. And that's a real power move, and he was impeccably turned out. He had the best clothes of any man I've ever met, and was always, at least half an hour ahead of everybody else. So he was somebody who popped up in my life at intervals. We had a lot of mutual friends, and we were always going to do a project together, which never materialized. And at the same time, we had subcutaneous linkage. We were both students. We've both been educated by the Jesuits, which I don't know. For me, like people who've been through the Jesuits, we have a secret siblinghood. This piece was, it was written as a book review, but really it's a kind of obituary summing up, even though, it happened a couple of years after he died. But he was definitely a key figure as well as an anomalous figure in that downtown world, because he was the closest thing to, he was like an ad guy. He was a 60s establishment figure, really, but somehow passed as one of the hippest people in town. So I love that paradox. And I just wanted to try to, give the sense of what Glenn was like, which you can get to a certain extent from his own writings, although many of them are perishable because they were just columns and they're of the moment. And once the moment is passed, they require way too much interlinear translation, but so I was trying to convey Glenn.
Yeah, and he's one of these figures that, I couldn't really sum up what he actually did in a sense. I know that he was a writer, but he seems to have had this tremendous influences in the Warhol world, right? And
he wasn't primarily a writer. He was primarily a mover and a designer, and one of those conceptual masterminds in the magazine world. There probably are some right now, but I think of well, I'm going to have a senior moment here, so I'm going to drop that question. But I was thinking of the modernists brought in by Condé Nast in the 40s and 50s. Europeans relocate. He was like that, except he wasn't fully American.
And so if we look at that scene again, there's somebody who looms really large in our culture these days as a representative of this time and place. And she's in your book, and you call her, Mother Courage in a sense. And this is Patti Smith. So let's talk about Patti Smith as well, as a person of this time, rather than maybe the sort of Saint Patti that we know today with such a huge aura around her when she was just starting out. I guess talk about that idea of Mother Courage. What is that? What are we getting at there?
Well, Mother Courage was the title picked out for the piece, and when it appeared in the New York Review of Books. I'm not sure, it might have been my choice. She's certainly Mother Courage in the sense that, she's endured all these deaths and career, and she quit her job. She quit at the height of her popularity, really, in 1979, to become a housewife, to marry Fred Sonic Smith and move out to Detroit and raise kids, and came back, and she seems indestructible. But I'm really writing about the early part of her career because I never describe myself as a fan. I greatly admire X, but I'm not a fan. I think kind of it's a posture of submission to be a fan. But I was a fan of Patti Smith's. I saw her first in 1973 when I was 19. And until her first album came out, really, I mean, I think I saw her like something like 75 to 80% of her New York appearances at every kind of music venue you could imagine. And she was somebody, yeah, she was presenting herself as a fan. She was a fan of Bob Dylan, of Brian Jones, of Keith Richards, blah, blah, and would laud these people. But she was also making herself up. And it was this mixture of she was a beat poet and a chanteuse and a stand-up comedian and all these things. And you never quite knew. I mean, no two shows were alike. Even if she performed the same pieces, she wouldn't perform them the same way. There was a lot of spontaneous interaction going on. She was just electrifying, and she was like nobody else at that time. So I was, she was one of the biggest influences on me in my late teen years and early 20s. And I don't know, I'm not that big a fan of the stuff she's done more recently, but she's immortal for that early stuff, especially.
And that's fascinating to think of her as making it up and really drawing on all these things. And I was wondering, Rambo and Baudelaire and all these people that her kind of people that she's drawing from, did she kind of bring, I mean, was that in the culture at that time, in the current of that downtown scene, or was this something that she kind of helps, was her own, in the sense, like, this is my thing? Those French ones.
Yeah, she did. Although, I mean, Rambo was not unknown to the pop audience because of Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison was always citing Rambo. And in fact, Wallace Fowley, one of the great Rambo scholars, wrote an entire book comparing Rambo and Jim Morrison, which is kind of embarrassing. And Rambo, the New Directions books came out in paperback in the late 60s. They were very visible. I used to carry my Enid Starkey biography around with me so everybody would see it. But Patti made him, brought him up to a higher shelf, and also was, will be forever identified with him, Go Rambo and Go Johnny Go is the permanent soundbite affixed to her. You don't hear that so much in discussions of Patti Smith anymore, but it was like the second sentence of every piece written about her in the 70s, certainly.
Great. Maybe two more people, and then I want to start talking about the times. And maybe someone who wasn't necessarily hanging out at Mud Club and CBGB's, but certainly loomed large as a New York character and large in your life, Barbara Epstein. Or I don't know if she went to Epstein or Epstein.
Epstein.
And you write, she possessed one of the greatest minds I've ever encountered, and she gave all of it to other people's work, which is so lovely. And again, I think is talking about these people who sort of connect and move and shake in the culture, and we might not necessarily be household names, but certainly change the culture. So, she was, of course, the co-founder of the New York Review of Books. So, tell me a bit about your connection to Barbara Epstein and how she figures.
Well, I got a job in the mailroom at the New York Review through a college friend whose father was the business manager, and I this was the height of my partying and drug days, and I'd show up for 4 hours and nobody gave me any trouble, but I felt like the resident sleazeball, basically. And to my astonishment, after a year of this, Barbara asked me to be her assistant, and I'd certainly done nothing to show that I was a diligent worker, and I type with one finger. And I'd never made a restaurant reservation, but Barbara took me under her wing, and we connected. And she was my greatest teacher ever, and really one of my best friends as well, despite the big age difference. And the thing about Barbara, Martin Scorsese made a movie about the New York Review a few years ago, and it's all about Bob Silvers, who was the other editor. And it's great because, I mean, Bob was remarkable polymath and, managed to keep up with the latest in like 4 dozen different fields. He was astonishing. But Barbara was equally astonishing, and she doesn't nearly get as much mention in the picture, but partly because Bob was still alive when it was made, and Barbara had been dead for about 4 or 5 years. But Bob was the experts guy. So he had all the experts, or not all of them, but he had many of the experts. You know, something is happening in Polynesia. Who's our Polynesia guy? And he would know the Polynesia guy who'd read, you know, written half the books on whatever. Barbara was the writer's editor. I mean, there's some, you know, this is not hard and fast because Bob was Joan Didion's editor, for example, but Barbara tended to have the stylists, and she had a few of the experts as well, but that was the main division of labor. So Barbara was the one who, you know, went for the left field things, went for the non-traditional modes of expression, went for, you know, investigations into things that might have been hard to categorize. And she was just a very lively presence, a wonderful sense of humor and of mischief too. There was always something of the teenager about Barbara, which was so remarkable and so touching and endearing. With her passing, left a huge hole in my life. I think, I mean, I've seen many people die in my day, at my present age, but I think Barbara might have been the single biggest loss for me. This was the piece there was written for right after her death, when dozen or so people who'd been close to her wrote eulogies.
And forgive me for interrupting. That was what I wanted to say. Is you can really feel that in the piece, that it's a sort of, that it's a very personal message to her in a sense. Is it true that she helped to edit or edited the Diary of Anne Frank?
No, she did more than that. She picked it out of the slush pile. She was an editorial assistant at Simon and Schuster. I forget what the publisher. And this literally came in over the transom from Anne Frank's father, and she picked it out and published. You know, and it got her superiors to publish it, and remained close to Otto Frank for the rest of his life. I met him. He came into the office at least once. So yeah, she doesn't often get credit for that, but that was her first major accomplishment.
I mean, incredible. Changed the world.
Mm-hmm.
One last person I want to talk about, and then I want to move on to the Times. But another one of these people who pops up here and there in interesting ways, but I think was a key figure. Rene, I don't know if he went by Ricard or Ricard.
Rene Racard is how he pronounced it.
Rene Racard. Again, to my generation, the few people who might be familiar with him, he pops up for a few moments. A version of him pops up for a few moments in the Basquiat movie, right? Saying that we have to throw all this money at artists because we don't want another Van Gogh. I mean, I don't know if that was true to life, but maybe, you know, what's your version of Rene Racard, and why is it somebody that we should really look into, who's perhaps quite obscure?
Rene was many things, but, you know, he was the closest thing to a 19th century maker of epigrams that we had in Lower Manhattan. He only wrote like 4 or 5 art critical pieces for Art Forum, but they're all stone classics. What I didn't even know about in his lifetime were his paintings. I mean, I knew he bought paintings at the thrift store and would paint his poems over them. But what I didn't realize is that sometimes he copied the whole thing. He copied the thrift store painting with his, exactly. He was a great painter. And, you know, during his life, I'm not sure that more than a dozen people even realized this. He cut a large figure. He was also, you know, a ne'er-do-well, as everybody was in that society. He burned down his apartment, which was only a floor, maybe 2 floors above mine. It was terrifying. Lots of Basquiats and Schnabels were lost in that fire. But he was, and he could be very, very bitchy and dismissive and curt, and he could also demonstrate a very large heart too. So He's larger than life, definitely. Someday there'll be a biopic and it'll be horrible, but yeah.
Well, okay, that's perfect segue to my next question, because larger than life and the horrible biopic. When we speak about these times, right, again, I know that the book is expansive and covers a lot of ground, but if we're looking at a core of late 70s, 80s, New York, and as I said, sort of a downtown scene, not exclusively, there is so much nostalgia, there is so much myth making, glamorization, especially now. It seems like in the last 5 years, I mean, I can't, like, certain Talking Head songs are just everywhere. All of a sudden, Scorsese, of course, had that vinyl show on HBO, which was supposed to be a kind of recreation. So I don't think that this book is that and does that, but there is, what do you feel about the nostalgia trade in this time, and maybe what you might be doing that's different, or do you think that's okay to sort of like, what's wrong with nostalgia in a sense? Mm-hmm. So what do you think about the role of New York, the East Side, especially that scene in today's culture?
Well, I mean, it was an important period, no matter how you slice it. And its fundamental bases are completely gone and not even very well understood by anybody today, because, they could say, okay, well, these records came out and painters started showing up, filmmakers, and it sounds very exciting and all that, and it was very exciting, but they don't understand that basically nobody had any money, and we lived in squalor. Of course, we had cheap rent, and the basis for a rational society or a good society of any sort has to be cheap housing. You cannot have life without cheap housing, and cheap housing is unavailable today pretty much anywhere. And they also don't realize, like it's like the movies made of the past where it's 1955, so everybody has the new car because it's the movies, and that's people's picture of downtown Manhattan, not realizing how much past there was, how much of a working class neighborhood, a working class Ukrainian and Dominican neighborhood this was. How we were really a minority. We were just a very loud minority, but a minority nevertheless. And so the conditions for the making of this work, I was trying to explain to a younger person how, the difference between, because, well, what always springs to mind is Brian Eno's word, scenius, the genius of the scene. It's a collective thing. And probably there's undoubtedly not a half, maybe not a quarter of the great stuff that came out of the city then would have been possible were people more atomized. Now, like if you get an apartment in Manhattan, but your best friends have to live in the Bronx, or it's not the same thing when, this is what I was trying to explain to a young person, what it was like to go out to the bodega on the corner for a quart of milk, and on the way you'd run into 7 people, and some of them were just like nod and wave, but somebody else might be someone you'd have an adventure with. I mean, this is how ideas get transmitted. It's through, it's not by having formal chats. It's not even really by sitting in a cafe. It's by this constant interaction, brushing by people, and, things forming by accident, more or less, but directed accident.
Yeah, one really gets a sense of space and spatial necessity of a creative, scene, in a sense that you have to sort of bump into each other and look at each other and hear each other, right? And to see what's going on. Have you been? I mean, when was the last time you were back in Manhattan?
Monday.
Okay.
I've actually, this was only the 3rd time I've been in New York City in the past year. Normally, but pre-COVID, I might be there every week. But I tend to avoid downtown. Mm-hmm. There's only so much avoidance I can do because I still have a lot of friends who live down there and there are cultural events and so on. But the East Village as currently constituted pretty much creeps me out. The restaurant culture, I mean, you know, it's an awful thing to say because so many restaurants have gone under in the past year, but that seemed to be the focus. I mean, everything that was once a bookstore, a record store, or whatever became a restaurant. It's like the only form of consumption that couldn't be done over the internet, right? So New York was on track to being all, you know, phone stores, banking, and restaurants. And that would be all you have on the streets. There's no place to hang out, you know, like record stores and bookstores were not just about records and books. They were about hangouts. They're about meeting people. They're about talking to the shop owner for 3 hours in the middle of the afternoon. So all that is just, you know, I'm not saying it's completely disappeared, but it's been much reduced over the years with A, real estate, and B, the internet. Anyway, what was the question?
No, that was, I mean, that's just, hey, that was the answer, whatever the question was. And it also sort of tees me up for another question about a change over time, which is the process by which these sentences in this book accrued, because there's so many different ways that you came about this writing. And I was touched to see, or quite excited to see that there was some of the most thoughtful reactions to the book were by people who looked to me like they were maybe right at the beginning of their careers as writers, people in their 20s and 30s, judging by the, sort of their CVs and the publications. And I love that. And I was wondering, you know, if we can reverse engineer this book, is there any sort of process? Are you thinking like, I just saw Patti Smith, I have to get that down? Or are you saying like, I see something in the culture, I want to get this? Or is it just like Barbara Epstein's assigned you something? I mean, how does this work accumulate, and what are you trying to do over time? Is this just rent money? I mean, what's going on here? Is it all of that?
A lot of them were prompts, you know, which is to say that, I mean, I thought for years I'd want to write about Patti Smith, but sometimes engaging a subject, you know, in a void, as it were, doesn't really work. So when Bob Silvers called and said, you know, we'd like a piece on Patti Smith, with his mid-Atlantic accent, I was ready and I wrote it in 3 days. And that often is the case. You know, I have a list in the back of my mind of things I'd like to write about, but I need an occasion much of the time. Of course, there is a lot of the book really came from my blog, which I ran for a couple of years, in 2007 to 2009. And there I was self-assigning. And eventually I stopped, you know, because I'm not good at self-assigning. You know, I start trying to outsmart myself. But anyway, so yeah, I'm very grateful for all those editors who've given me occasions to say what I was really needing to say.
And a deadline, right?
Yeah. Well, not that I'm very good with those.
And then I guess if I can ask the reverse of that question, which is now that it's all here in a physical object that you can hold, a lot of it is about sort of connections. These as that run through, there's like certain words that will reappear and scenes that will reappear in different guises and different forms and different pieces. Do you see as a whole certain patterns emerging that maybe weren't clear to you at the time of writing? I mean, are you looking back and saying, oh, wow, that's really what I was talking about?
Well, it became clear in the process of putting it together, you know, because when my editor first asked for a collection, I started doing what I did with my first collection, Kill All Your Darlings, which was to find representative pieces for different, you know, like here is the piece about Lower Manhattan, here is the piece about the blues. But here I was struck by, at first, I couldn't deal with the fact that there were so many overlaps. And there's, you know, an account of Rene Racard's Fire, for example, shows up in 2 pieces. There are things like that. And then I realized, no, the strength of the book is going to precisely lie in those overlaps. So rather than trying to edit them out, I found myself looking for as many overlaps as possible. So it wasn't really a revelation to me that much of this book would be about that period, roughly 1977 to 1982, because it was the most intense period of my education, and none of it happened in school. You know, I probably would have preferred it if the whole book were about that, but since it's a collection, I try to find, and somehow I had this internal meter, you know, I could bring in a piece about H.P. Lovecraft because I read him as a teenager, but I couldn't bring in a piece about, I don't know, I'm not thinking, but some other author who doesn't have that personal sort of linkage to me. Yeah, I don't know that there were specific revelations, except about the number of overlaps that there were, really about the number of times I want to return to that. And frankly, often with a book, I feel like, okay, I've killed that subject dead. I felt that way about my first book. I never want to write about old New York ever again as long as I live. But this period, I know I still probably have more to say, you know, so it's ongoing. And, you know, and it's interesting that I couldn't have written about this stuff while it was going on. I needed, the more removed, the better, really.
Fair enough, good point. And are there things that you feel like you've missed that you missed at the time? Like, oh, I totally did not see that thing coming in that milieu, in that scene, in that culture. And now I can, you know, or did you think, you know, that you had sort of a good antenna? I mean, I guess you don't have to have one without the other, but are there things that you sort of feel that?
I don't know that I missed anything that was really important to me. My regret has to do with the fact that I was so shy that I didn't talk to people. I was lurking in the corner of the room. You know, I mean, it still happens to me that I'll meet people that actually it really happened to me more 20 years ago when I was known for my first book, and I'd meet people who I remembered meeting in the 70s, and they were excited to meet me because I'd written this book, but they had no idea that we'd socialized on multiple occasions because I was invisible. And you know, and it happens all the time, especially when people die. So, you know, with Rene, I wish I'd spent more time with him. I wish I'd spent more time with Glenn. Oh gosh, my dear friend Barbara S. just died last month, and we were friends, but you know, I feel like I didn't spend enough time with her. She's somebody I met downtown in 1979 and ended up teaching with at Bard, but I feel like, you know, I didn't get enough of this person, you know, so that's my regret is that, you know, I mean, probably it benefited the writing because I was back in the corner taking mental notes. And if I'd been more involved, I might not have been able to do that. But nevertheless, that's my regret.
That was going to be my point of like, you know, this sounds like a writer to me, the guy in the corner, shy. So are you, speaking of teaching, are you teaching this spring?
I am, yeah.
What are you teaching?
In the spring semester, I teach writing. Okay. And I do a reading and writing course where it's, I don't do a workshop. I give assignments every week.
What are they reading this week?
They read short pieces and, well, I mean, they're very diverse. Actually, this week's assignment, I gave them Auction 1934 by Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, which is their collaborative piece where they're putting up their whole former life up for auction.
Not familiar with it. Sounds fascinating.
I think it's in the crack up.
Okay, cool. You know, I was gonna, and I think this is maybe we're getting toward the end of the conversation. And I was thinking that you might have been teaching photography. So I had my secret, you know.
I teach that in this fall. Yeah.
And I did want to talk about photography because I know it's something that you teach, and I know it's something that looms large. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the photographers in this book are actually not of that period. We're talking about Ouija, who comes a little earlier. I mean, was there anybody, or am I wrong? Were there photographers of that scene and that time that were important to you?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, the late Jimmy DeSana was amazing, who died of AIDS, early 90s, I believe. worth looking up. Desana, great photographer. But there are plenty of people still around. You know, people who, Julia Gordon, for example, really kind of invented a certain look, this no wave look. I mean, she was fundamental. And David Godless. These are people, he's still a street photographer, and he took definitive pictures of CBGB and the early no wave moment. There's a book called History is Made at Night, which is very good. You know, so yeah, there are a whole bunch of photographers.
So that sort of borrowing of no wave, so you're talking like late 70s, right? Music, and is translating into the visual form. Is that you're really seeing that in terms of like they're not just shooting bands in clubs? There's something. There's an aesthetic. Do you think that's similar?
There was, yes, because no wave was music, but it was also films. You know, the films of Eric Mitchell, the films of Amos Poe, a whole bunch of people, Vivian Dick, the great Vivian Dick, James Nares, they all, along with Julia Gordon's still photographs, they helped create this look, which was part film noir, part nouvelle vague, part, you know, it's kind of stark black and white, high contrast, urban, and Nan Golden, of course, came slightly different route because she moved to New York in 1980 from Boston and had already established her style there, but her slideshows kind of changed the game. And that's something I'm about to write about, actually, for slideshows.
Cool. Well, that's, I guess, my last question before we start asking people for theirs is about photography, because you write a lot about the past, right? And a lot of it is photographs figure into that writing. So what is, you know, what roles does a photograph do for you as a historical document of getting you to like get into the past? You know, what's your take on why you want to go to photography so often, it seems?
Well, for me, a good photograph has to score high on both arms of the graph. There's the socio-historical and the aesthetic. And I kind of need both in a photograph. I need both really strong graphic imagery, but also a sense of elsewhere. That the thing I treasure most about the past is the disorientation. You know, that 1981 doesn't seem like that far away, but if you didn't have previous experience of it and you were thrown into 1981, you'd be utterly lost. Maybe not true, but, you know, I mean, especially when you get back to 1911 or, you know, 1871, it's, you know, the human nature is eternal, but the facts of life change from month to month. And and this is something I get into in my writing a lot, is trying to pin down the flavor, like at 1981 in that case of that piece. But, you know, I'm really, really interested in how different 1981 was from 1980 and 1982. And you could say that about any date. It's not just, you know, it's any date in human history, really, but the ones that I've experienced myself, you know, it's like different seasons. I mean, it's all kinds of the clothes that people wear, the ambient songs, the atmosphere. I mean, whether people are paranoid, whether they're relaxed, whether they're stoned out of their minds, it changes from year to year. And I like a photograph that preserves as much of that flavor integral to a particular date as possible.
Well said, thank you. And Alice, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Luke. This is fantastic. I almost hesitate to kind of intrude in what's become such a lovely discussion, but we do have some really interesting questions in the chat. And just a reminder, if you haven't posted your question or your comment we are now moving to the section of the event where we're going to be asking those questions. So please post them. Luke, you had mentioned that you know, one of the many strengths of your book is the notion of the overlap And so Heather wants to know, she says she'd be very interested to hear more about your collages, and do you see a connection between your kind of conception of the essay and the collage?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah, I've been making collages since I was a teenager, and during this period I was making band flyers. Then I stopped for a long time, resumed only a few years ago. And yeah, I think there is. I try to, I'm interested in collages. I'm interested in the visual rhetoric of the past, and I'm interested in, both the fluidity of moving from one rhetoric to another, one style of rhetoric to another, and also the jarring contrast. And I'm trying, I've got a little bit of an impulse toward narrative in my collages, as I do in my writing. It's a really interesting question. It's one that I'll have to investigate further. Thank you for asking.
Okay, so we'll stay tuned for the response. Jessica wants to know if you've noticed how your writing has changed over your career. Have you noticed stylistically any changes? What have been the changes, in your opinion?
Yeah, I do. And one thing I notice is, well, Barbara Epstein, as I say, was my great teacher, and she taught me to be clear and to avoid, poetistic flights that don't actually mean anything. But the thing, well, she published a piece of mine in the New York Review the year before she died. And well, what it was the 10th anniversary introduction I'd written to my book Low Life. And it was this big, long, rambling kind of memory swirl. And it appears in the later editions of Low Life as I wrote it. But Barbara, when it came, she said she wanted it to the magazine, but I have to cut it by 2/3. And that was revelatory. And it's something I now do with everything I write before it goes out. I try to cut as much as possible.
Can you describe that process?
I'm sorry?
Can you describe that process? How do you cut specifically?
Well, first you start by removing paragraphs.
Removing the organs.
I'm sorry?
No, it's just like removing the organs, removing.
Yeah, kind of. It's like that. Yeah. I mean, you start with the big organs and then you move down to the capillaries, so it starts with paragraphs, then sentences, then phrases, then words, and have a target number sometimes, not always, but I do try to boil my writing down to the nub, really. That's something I've really been practicing only for about 15 years now.
So we have a fairly punchy question from Gabby, and I'm just going to read it in its entirety. Gabby says, video killed the radio star. Did social media kill the scene, the artist?
No. What killed the scene was real estate. Absolutely. It's all about real estate. I mean, what happened is that social media was fated to come along anyway, actually happened to come along to make a kind of scene when real estate had made the physical scene impossible. So if you want, social media is a kind of rescue function. It's not the devil in this case, although it had, leaves much to be desired for many different reasons. But it's as much of a neighborhood as most kids are going to get these days.
Actually, this is kind of related to another question we had about, Rebecca wants to know if you think interaction is more possible now. I mean, I don't know how well you know Paris, Luke, but the assumption of this question is that you know Paris well. And Rebecca says, do you think interaction is more possible in Paris now than New York? And I guess I would kind of add, is there a kind of equivalent to New York in the late 70s and 80s? What would be the contemporary equivalent, if not Paris? I mean,
Gosh, you got me there. I mean, Paris has always been more oriented around, well, cafes and hence hangouts. You don't really have that in New York because bars are loud. you can't talk. And you're discouraged from hanging out in most places. I mean, I do remember when, you know, you could go to a bar in the afternoon and nurse a beer for the next 5 hours and all your friends would come by. But that doesn't exist anymore. And, you know, it's not really going to happen at Starbucks. So I do think that European cities have the advantage there. As far as Paris today, I mean, you know, frankly, I haven't been to Paris. The last time I was in Paris was to appear at the library in 2017. So it's been a while. And I keep getting spot reports from the streets of Paris, and it looks a little crazy there right now. But then New York looks a little crazy there too. And I live in a quiet little village here. So yeah, I beg ignorance there.
Well, you must come back, obviously.
Yeah.
I have two of my own questions that I would love to ask you. My first question is, Luke, to what extent did you think you realized while you were kind of living this moment that the times would in fact become the times? Did you think you knew something kind of that you were living through something remarkable?
Yeah.
Respect?
Well, you know, the funny thing is that at the time, and, you know, bearing in mind the fact that there wasn't just this lively art scene going on, but there was also, you know, decaying buildings, decaying infrastructure. There was, you know, drugs and robbery and, you know, bad stuff going on everywhere around. And also that, you know, every structure we knew was built around 1890. And they were often a combination of squalid and ruined, rotten, and had been kind of badly built to begin with. But they had all this narrative interest because there would be, you know, the cornices and entablatures, and, you know, there was all this 19th century architectural rhetoric going on. And it kind of felt like, I say that at a point in one of the pieces, that it was like the dust heap of history. I mean, we were watching, like, and there was a way in which I thought, you know, this is the end of the world, but it's a soft end. You know, things are just gently going to decay, and we're going to decay along with them. And I was cool about that. I thought, what better way for the world to end than this? You know, it's not an atomic blast. It's just slowly rotting like leaves on a forest floor. But such.
Lovely. That's lovely. What a lovely image. I guess my final question would be, you mentioned, you know, you've described a lot of things that we no longer have with us today. I mean, I could count them off, but you've kind of mentioned them over the course of the talk. And what do you miss? What do you miss about the times?
Well, I miss, you know, well, I mean, I miss the things that are particular to youth, such as, you know, having this network such as I walk to the corner store and meet 9 people. But I miss the quality of this leisurely sense of time. And, you know, I miss hanging out. And I miss hanging out in the sense of both hanging out with friends, but also, you know, I came down to this neighborhood to see a movie, but I'm half an hour early. And what should I do in that interval? Well, there, you know, I can like browse through these bookstores, etc. That, you know, has really disappeared now. I mean, I have to go at least buy a cup of coffee. I can't hang out anywhere for free. Um, and I don't get the experience that goes along with hanging out in junk shops or whatever, where you get free ideas. You know, a cup of coffee is not going to give you free ideas. So yeah, that's the main thing I miss.
Okay, lovely. And we ask all of our authors this because we are a library and we all love to read, but what do you have by your bedside table? What are you reading at the moment?
At the moment, I'm reading Walter Benjamin at the Dairy Queen by Larry McMurtry. I'd read some Larry McMurtry before his passing, but I'd never read that one, and it's wonderful. It's about Texas and storytelling, and really lovely book.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Luke, and thank you, Mark, who's kind of disappeared, but thank you for being such a wonderful question poser, and thank you for being our fellow for this year at the library.